Today's book is called A Framework for Task-Based Learning by Jane Willis. So, if it's not obvious from the title, this is a book I read for professional development. It was not pleasure reading. Although it was not quite as bad as I thought it was going to be. But I'll get into that more later. We have a bit of a book club going at work. We read one book for professional development every month, and we use the list of books which are recommended for Delta Module 1 because a lot of people are either doing the Delta or have ambitions to do the Delta at some point in the future, which includes me. So after the last meeting, we were going through the list and we were saying, okay, what looks good to you? What looks good to you? And somebody said, what about a framework for task-based learning? Now, I'll be honest, this sounded boring to me, but you know, it's a book club for professional development. It's not supposed to be pleasure reading. It doesn't matter if it's boring. So I said, yeah, fine, that works, I'll read it. And we read it, and actually, it's pretty interesting. Or, let me qualify that. Parts of it are really interesting. So, I didn't realize this in advance, or I had either known it or forgot it, but Jane Willis is the wife of Dave Willis, or was. He passed away a couple of years ago. And Dave Willis, I had read one of his books about a year and a half ago called, I think it was called Rules, Patterns, and Words or something like that. But Dave Willis is an interesting guy. He kind of, along with Michael Lewis, was one of the pioneers of the lexical approach. And not only that, but his book was just really interesting. He writes really well. Jane Willis, his wife, also writes really well, I'm happy to report. So the beginning chapter here, and kind of she talks about kind of common myths about language learning, or kind of what are your views, and talks about what are the components for essential language learning. It was all really interesting. You know, I thought this book was just going to be really boring, but it was really interesting. And then the first kind of couple chapters, I think, where she talks about the theoretical framework and why we need task-based learning, was really well written and really interesting. The middle chapters were a little bit of a slog, and that's not Jane Willis's fault. That's just, I think that it's a necessary evil. Kind of, she lays out exactly how to stage a lesson, how to manage the different stages, what to do. And so by that point, you're getting into the nuts and bolts of it. And it's well written for what it is, but it's, I don't know. This kind of stuff can only be so interesting. Like, very useful, but not so interesting to just kind of read straight through. And I did find a little bit, you know, when you get to the end of the page and you realize you hadn't been paying attention to what you were reading, so you have to go back and do it again. Not so bad, but a little bit. And then the last couple chapters were, again, more theoretical, and I found them very interesting, even if I did have some reservations about the last two chapters. Reservations mean there were parts I disagreed with, maybe. But it was interesting as far as it went. Okay. So, what is task-based learning? She goes into a lot of detail here about the different stages of a task-based learning and kind of how you should frame it and how you should stage it. And I don't really, it's not my intention to just kind of go through everything she goes through, because you'd really have to read the book for that. But just kind of in brief, a task is kind of something the learners are working on with an outcome. And she has kind of 6 general tasks, which she talks about in the back. Where are they? Listing, so like coming up with a list of, I don't know, all the ways to get to school or something. Ordering and sorting, so you have a list and you decide which is the most important, which is the second most important. comparing two things, problem solving. They're all problem solving almost, but like problem solving is a specific one. Sharing personal experiences, and then number 6 is creative tasks. I think that's more of a catch-all. But they're different. They're either building towards a speaking outcome, or maybe they're building towards a written outcome, although they're done in groups, so even if it's a written outcome, the students are speaking during the task. And they're different than a traditional English classroom, because in a traditional English classroom, you'd say to the students, okay, talk about sports, or here are some questions to talk about sports. I'm guilty of this. I do this all the time. Just give the students a list of questions about the topics, have them talk about them in groups. But Jane Willis says, well, that's not really ideal, because they need some sort of purpose to talk about it. They need some sort of task to achieve. A point she makes very early on in the book is that to achieve fluency in a language, to learn a language, you need to have lots of input, you need to have opportunities to practice using it, and you need to have motivation. Now, the teacher can give them lots of input, the teacher can make them practice it, but the teacher can't really give them motivation. They either kind of have the motivation or they don't. That's almost kind of like an external factor outside the teacher's control. But Jane Willis says, okay, you can't control the larger motivation to learn the language, but you can give them temporary motivation to use a language by giving them a task. So here's a task, here's the outcome you need. Now they've got a motivation to use the language for the next 20 minutes, or however long the task is. So this kind of having some sort of an outcome where you come up with a list at the end and you have to agree on the definitive list. Or another example she uses is spot the differences in the picture. So you have one picture, your partner has the other picture. They're almost the same, but there are 7 small differences. You have to talk with your partner in the target language and find the differences in the picture. So something like that, where there's a very kind of defined task at the end, outcome, to give them a motivation to speak English in. So let me back up a minute and say that before I started this book, I was skeptical of task-based learning. One of the reasons I'm skeptical is because if you're in the field of teaching English as a second language, I think some of these things like task-based learning can be it's kind of almost like a buzzword nowadays. So I hear a lot of people talking about task-based learning curriculums. And also at my school, there's been a big push within the last couple of years to transfer over to a project-based learning curriculum. Project-based learning is a little bit different than task-based learning, but for the purposes of this discussion, I'm just going to ignore that difference and kind of talk about them like they're the same. So in these curriculums I'm working with, you have a lot of tasks like, you and your partner decide on the 7 best ways to get to school and make a list. And you just look at it and you say, oh, that's so boring. And you're like, the kids aren't going to want to do that, and I don't blame them. It's like this stupid task that somebody else invented over the curriculum department, that just has absolutely no interest for the kids. And sure enough, working through a number of these projects that have kind of come through and are just kind of so boring, and the kids, the teenagers especially, just don't want to do it. And I've said to myself numerous times, and occasionally said to my colleagues, I said, we've got this completely the wrong way round. Because the thing about English or studying a foreign language is that the teenagers don't inherently hate it. You know, they like English movies, they like English songs, they like English comic books, you know, they like all these things in English. They just hate kind of these stupid tasks we make them do in the English classroom, you know, or, you know, write a report about your friend or something like that. So like, why not just take the things that they're interested in anyways and make that the curriculum? You know, like take one of these Avengers movies that they're so excited about and just kind of get the language from the movie. You know, make movie worksheets. You can get all the vocabulary and grammar and stuff from the movie rather than having them do a reading on renewable energy, which always pops up in all these ESL books. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. My point is I felt like these tasks were just kind of too much school, like too much of a classroom or scholastic or something. They were just so boring. I thought the key to getting the kids interested in English is to give them kind of input in material that they're interested in anyways, and then kind of get the language out of that. And I still kind of think that a little bit. The problem with that, though, is it doesn't really do much for their speaking. I mean, I think it's good as far as it goes. And I still show lots of movies in my classroom and try and get interesting stories for my students to read. But Jane Willis says, in order to learn a foreign language, you need lots of inputs, you need motivation, and you need practice using it. Now, you know, the movies and the stories and the music will go right with the input, but they still need practice using it. Or do they? So maybe they don't. This is a quick digression. But Stephen Krashen is of the opinion, actually, that they don't need to practice it. He says, just by listening to it, if they build up their listening comprehension, that will automatically transfer over to speaking fluency. Now, people are skeptical of this, but if you read Krashen's book, he's got some interesting arguments. He's got some case studies he presents where there is like a really shy student who didn't want to say anything. So she spent like the first several months of the classroom not saying anything and just listening to her friends talk. And then, once she decided that she was ready, she started talking, and she was at an equal level to all her classmates, even though she'd never been doing any of the speaking practice with them. Simply by just kind of listening to it, she was able to pick up the same level of fluency as the people who were practice speaking it. So, that is an interesting counter-argument, and it's worth putting in the back of your brain, or kind of putting a pin in somewhere and say, okay, that's interesting to note. But I think the majority of people say that in order to learn a language to any level of fluency, you need some practice getting your mouth around it. You need to kind of just develop kind of the muscle memory or the habits of kind of speaking it yourself. Krashen would disagree, but we'll just put that aside for now. And for the purposes of this book, let's posit that you need speaking practice. Okay, so if you need some sort of speaking practice, then what are you going to do? Say, okay, just talk with your partner about sports. Or do a role play, you're the customer, you're the shopkeeper. You know, these kind of activities that have no meaningful outcome for the students aren't going to motivate them to practice speaking. So, you know, I realize my own experience has been some task-based curriculums don't interest the students, but the question is, well, as compared to what? As compared to giving them no speaking practice? As compared to giving them speaking practice with no outcomes? Because that's, especially with teenagers, in my experience, that's even worse. Adult students will do it. You say, okay, talk about this, and adult students will talk about it. Teenagers will just like, I don't want to talk about it. And then they'll just kind of sit there quietly for 5 minutes. So for teenagers, I think it's really, Jane Willis has kind of made a convert out of me. I think having a task is probably really useful for them. And since I've been reading this book in the past couple weeks, I've been experimenting with this a little bit. So what I used to do as kind of a lead into a topic is just give my students some general discussion questions about the topic, whatever the topic for the day happens to be. What I've been trying to do recently is give my students a task, like, here are a bunch of statements about the topic. You and your group have to decide whether you agree or disagree, but you all have to, come to the same agreement about each of them, like something like that. And I've noticed, even, for my adult students, the energy and enthusiasm in the room just goes up dramatically when there's some sort of outcome for the task like that. In retrospect, I think my managers have been telling me this for years. I just, haven't been listening. But it's really increases the potential amount of enthusiasm the students can have when the projects have a discernible outcome. I forgot what I was going to say. But that's the danger of doing these videos unscripted. The point is, I think they work. It seems to help to have an outcome for the task. I remember what I was going to say. So, coming back to what I was saying earlier, yes, I did have some experience with curriculums with project-based learning and task-based learning that didn't catch the students' interest. But catching the students' interest is always easier said than done. It's always touch and go. You try something, maybe it gets their enthusiasm, maybe it doesn't. You get something that's a little bit boring, maybe you can rework it a little bit if this isn't, curriculum that's imposed on you. So I know the individual tasks can be touch and go in terms of how much they engage a student. But the general framework itself, I think Jane Willis has done a good job of convincing me that this is quite useful for the students. Where I would part company a little bit with her is I would put task-based learning as one tool out of many in the teacher's toolbox. Say, okay, task-based learning, that's great. I'm still going to do the stories in the classroom. And I'm still going to do some, grammar exercises. And I'm still going to, do all the rest of it. Jane Willis is arguing kind of for a much more hardline view of task-based learning. Like, forget everything else. It's task-based learning every time, all the time, from here on out. She's really, especially in the last couple chapters, she's really pushing it quite hard. And yeah, it's a bit, I like what she's saying, but like, she does come on a little bit strong at times, especially the last couple chapters when she's talking about why task-based learning is the best way for all students to learn. And if students have objections, she says, here's how you can tell the students that this is the best way for them to learn. And I wrote in the margins on page, I think it was page 137. Yeah, I wrote right here in the margin, I said, yeah, why are you selling me on this? Like, just give me the option, maybe highlight the good points or something like that, but you don't have to sell me on it. Just, give it to me as a tool. I don't know, it got a little bit too polemical in the last couple chapters. And this was especially interesting because the previous book our book club had read was, Beyond Methods. Well, the book was The Language Teaching Matrix by Jack Richards. But kind of one of the key points in that book was an essay called Beyond Methods, in which Jack Richards says, look, the search for the perfect method, it's ridiculous. Stop searching for the perfect method and just kind of build kind of relationships with your students, or kind of focus on what's going on in the classroom and pay attention to what your students need. But we don't have to have like one uniform method which we impose on all the teachers. And I think Jack Richards, I forget when that book had come out, but that book was actually before this one came out, I think. This one came out in 1996. I think the Language Teaching Matrix was the early 90s. I could be getting that wrong. But I think this was after that essay came out. And yet this kind of felt like a step backwards. Like, okay, now we're going back to the perfect method. But I thought the field had agreed that the search for the perfect method was over now. I don't know. We were talking about this in my book club, and people like to talk about how, the field of ESL, we're now in post-methods. The search for the perfect method is over. But the search for the perfect method is never going to be over. Certain people have a certain personality type, and they're always going to be like, yes, but what is the best method? And so we're never going to get rid of that impulse entirely. 100 years from now, people will still be coming up and saying, no, 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 this is the best method to learn languages. So, like, you can write an essay called Beyond Methods, but you can't stop people from coming up with new methods. And this is a new kind of perfect method, a framework for task-based learning. I'm being critical now. I like it a lot. I like a lot of what she had to say. I didn't like how she was selling this as kind of the only way, or the best only way to learn languages. That's maybe a minor complaint. So, coming back to what Jane Willis was saying at the beginning, to learn a language you need input, use, and motivation. Now, with task-based learning, the students are doing a task in groups, so the use is pretty self-evident. And the motivation, I already talked about that. But where does the input come from? And in fact, before reading this book, that had been another one of my criticisms of some of the task-based learning curriculums I had encountered at my school. As I said, well, they need input, especially the lower the level, the more input heavy the lesson needs to be. So where are we getting the input in project-based learning and task-based learning? I think maybe in execution, people don't always do this right. But in theory, Jane Willis has got a lot of interesting ideas. So there's a pre-task stage in which the learners kind of maybe get some input about their topic. But she also has a really interesting idea. Like, for every task you do, you get a recording of proficient speakers doing the task. Now, Jane Willis makes a point in her book that it doesn't need to be exactly native speaker. Somebody who speaks English as a second language but is proficient will do just as well. But you can think maybe, I don't know, it's kind of like a native speaker here, or somebody close to native level proficiency, kind of doing the task. So for example, she gives the example, I'll use the one she uses, of spot the difference. So you have two different pictures, they've got to talk to their partner and find all the differences in it. And what she did is she recorded kind of two of her colleagues, kind of native speakers in the staff room, doing the exact same task. And what you get from that is you get input that you can use for the students. She says with closed tasks, kind of tasks where there's not a lot of variation in terms of what the correct answer is, you wouldn't want to play the recording before the task because that would give everything away. So you can play the recording after the task as like a language analysis. For more open tasks, where you have to like describe an experience or something like that, something more based on personal experience, then you can use it kind of before. And she makes a really interesting point in her book. She says in an English language classroom, the types of input that the student gets are usually two different types. Either it's the teacher talking, and she's actually a fan of teacher talking. She, like, in the CELTA you're taught always reduce your teacher talking time. Jane Willis sees the teacher talking time as valuable input for the student, so she's not against it. But she does recognize that it's only one type of input. So like the students are not going to hear, when they're listening to the teacher, they're not going to hear people negotiating in a conversation about whose turn it is to talk, or somebody kind of overlapping speaking with another person, or the strategies for holding a turn in a conversation, or just kind of all the features of real life conversation you're not going to get from listening to the teacher. Now the teacher does talk to the students, but that's totally different. They're just kind of nominating students, and it's a very kind of classroom interaction in which a teacher has got control over it. Now the students do also listen to dialogue from their textbooks, like, now listen to this conversation between two people talking about movies. These are in the ESL textbooks. But these are so artificial, and they're so cleaned up, and they're so scripted, they're just scripted out in advance, that you're not listening to a real English conversation with all kind of the features of real authentic conversation. And so she says the result of this is, they spend years in the ESL classroom, and then they go to America or they go to England or whatever, and they have no idea how to have a real English conversation with native speakers. I think this is true for a lot of languages, not just English. Certainly, my experience learning Japanese is, you spend a lot of time studying the textbook, and then you go to the bar, and you have no idea what anyone's saying, because, they're using all these kind of colloquialisms, and they're kind of interrupting each other, and there are all these strategies for politely interrupting, or for finishing off what you're saying, or just kind of all the mess of real conversation. But if you record two proficient speakers or two native speakers doing the spot the difference task, and you have all the interrupting and all the false starts and everything like that happens in this, then that's great input for the students, and you can play it before the task or after the tasks. Jane Willis suggests you make a transcript of it as well, so that they can hear it, but they can also see it. Then you can pull out useful language from the transcript and make that the language study. It's a great idea. How practical is it, though? That's the key. Jane Willis spends like a whole chapter talking about how you can make these recordings. Now she's writing all the way back in 1996. So, she's talking about using a tape recorder to make these recordings. Nowadays, I think you could just as easily make video recordings. And in fact, while I was reading this book, I thought, I should totally do this and put it on my YouTube channel, this channel you're watching right now. Like I have a number of speaking activities in my kind of, resources file. I should get a couple colleagues to do that speaking activity. I could videotape them. I could put it up on YouTube. I could write out the transcript, and it could just be, I could use it in my own classes. Other people could use it as a resource if they wanted to. I was on vacation, actually, while I was reading part of this book. We were traveling kind of through central Vietnam. And when you're on vacation, you kind of forget how busy real life is. And you're like, oh yeah, I could totally do that, and I'm going to do that, and I'll do that, and I'm going to do all this stuff. And then you get back, and your first day back at work, and you're just exhausted. You're like, oh, I've got no energy to do anything. And I think that's kind of what's happening to me. I had all these ideas that I was going to get all these speakers and make all these videos. It's I suppose you could say this about any job, but ESL teachers work a lot of hours. I mean, I know a lot of ESL teachers who are working two jobs, because let's face it, you don't get paid a lot as an ESL teacher. Some people, if they have a family and wife and kids to support especially, they work two jobs. They don't have time to spend the hours making these videos. I've got a lot more to say, but I'm out of time. And I've rambled on long enough, so I'm going to finish here.